class. Today we are going to examine the Great Depression and particularly focus on how wealth inequality leads to economic instability and the positive feedback loops that led to the Great Depression. So, as a review, the economy in the 1920s was doing well. It's what we call a boom economy. And we're going to go from a boom to a bust where everything's going to fall apart during the Great Depression. The Great Depression is going to be set off by a stock market crash in October of 1929, and it's going to last for over a decade. It will only really end because of World War II. So, the depression, an economic depression, is a prolonged downturn of economic activity. What this means is that there will be high unemployment rates, lots of people will lose their jobs. This will last over several business cycles. So businesses naturally go in cycles, kind of doing well and then not so well and then okay and then not so okay, back and forth and back and forth. And a depression is a situation where this lasts throughout all those. So when the economy should be going up, they're actually staying down. Okay. This can happen in one specific sector. So you could have, say, like heavy industry experience a depression, like heavy machinery and steel production, while the clothing sector is doing fine. Or you could also have it in the case of the Great Depression where it actually hits an entire economy. So every sector is being affected. With the downturn in unemployment, you're going to see fewer people with money to spend, so businesses are going to suffer, and so they're probably going to have to lay off more people. So it affects everybody in the country, or the world in the case of the Great Depression, because it was a global depression. There's not a more specific definition that I can give you. There's not like a nice, clear metric where I could say, well, if you have 20% unemployment, that is a depression. But if you have 19.9% unemployment, it's not. It's not that clear cut. We do have something else called an economic recession, which is like a depression in that it's a downturn of economic activity and an upturn in unemployment, but it's less severe than a depression. So the economy's not doing well during a recession, but it's not doing as bad as if it were a depression. And again, there's not like a specific number of people or percentage of people that would need to be unemployed that I can give you. You lived through the Great Recession in 2008. I mean, you were little, but you lived through it. The last Great Depression was in the 1930s, and it was called the Great Depression because it was a global depression. It was the longest and most severe of the 20th century. The United States has had over 30 depressions since it's existed, but sometimes they're just sector specific or they don't last as long. The Great Depression kind of put all of those other depressions to shame, and it was going to hit the whole world, whereas a lot of times those American depressions didn't hit the whole world, and we're going to look at why that is. Okay. All right. So the causes of the Great Depression. First of all, yes, it was set off by a stock market crash, and we'll talk about what that is. But I want to point out that the economy of the 1920s, even though it was this boom economy, it was booming for bad reasons. It was unstable and it was unsustainable. There were indicators that the economy was actually unhealthy. If you look specifically at farmers in the 1920s, they'd already been suffering. So while big business was doing well at this time in the banks, and people in the cities were doing pretty well, there's still definitely a poor underclass in the cities, but their people were doing well on the whole. The farmers had been suffering for a while. They'd never really recovered from that post-World War I economic slump that we said was completely predictable to have an economic slump after a war. And usually people recover from it within a year or two. Countries recover, but the farming sector never really had. And so that was an indicator. They were kind of what we call the canary in the coal mine, the first sign that there's trouble here. The other thing is a lot of this economic growth in the 1920s was based on what we call speculation in the stock market. So this is what's going to lead to the stock market crashing. The stock market, you may have heard of, it's essentially where people can go to invest in companies. They buy what's called stock. And the reason it's called stock is because it actually used to mean that, like, if there was a business that made sneakers, and you thought that business was going to be profitable, and that business needed investment. They wanted to build a new warehouse, but they didn't have the money to do it right off the bat. But like they were going to make money in the future, so you would get to recoup your investment. You would like buy a chunk of what they own. Say that you'd say like, well, here's $1,000. Your company's worth $10,000, so I'm basically buying 10% of your company, which essentially amounts to 10% of the stuff in your warehouse right now. And we call that stock, right? Like stock boys put things on the shelves in grocery stores. So you would actually own like 10% of the stock. You would own 10% of the sneaker materials. And then that company would take that $1,000 and they'd use it to build their new warehouse and grow their business. And then you would get a return of 10% of whatever profit the company makes going forward. You get 10% of that. And that's how the stock market works. So it's a way for businesses to raise money so that they can expand and grow their business. And that's helpful. But it should be tied to how profitable the business actually is. Like you shouldn't be giving a business worth $10,000 $2,000 for only 10% ownership, right? Because now you actually should have 20% ownership because 2,000 is 20% of 10,000. And so what's happening here is if people try and invest too quickly, they might be looking not so much to invest in the long-term profitability of a company, but just in their immediate payoff. So the idea is, hey, I heard this new company is hot. I bet it's going to make money. I'm going to invest. And then I don't really care what happens. I'm not even going to wait to see if that business gets more profitable. I'm going to turn around next week and sell this for even more. I'm going to try and boost the reputation of this company and say, like, I hear this sneaker shop is doing so hot. I'm going to buy, 10% for $1,000. But hey, buddy, have you heard about this? I just bought 10% for $1,000. But it's really a hot shot company. I'll sell it to you for $1,500 because this company's going places and you're going to want to get in on the ground floor. When they get so rich, you're going to get so much money. And so you sell it to somebody else for $1,500. You pocket that extra $500, and now they have paid $1,500 for value of a company that really is only worth $1,000 to them. So, and then they can turn around and do the same thing to somebody else and sell it for $2,000, and they can turn around and sell it to somebody for $2,500 or $3,000 or $4,000, and before you know it, somebody has bought 10% of ownership of a company for $4,000 when the company is only worth $10,000. So they've really overpaid. And it's essentially a matter of time before people realize that they've been artificially inflating the value of these companies and that what they're holding isn't actually as valuable as what they paid for it. And so what they're going to do is they're going to turn around and try and sell it to somebody else as fast as they can to recoup their loss before people start to figure out that this company actually isn't as valuable as everybody thought it was, because it hasn't even had the time to like turn around and make this investment because people are trying to sell it so quickly. So what happens is basically 1929, this has been going on for like a decade, and by October 1929, people start to realize that a lot of these stock prices are really inflated, and people start trying to sell them very quickly, and since they're trying to sell all at the same time, they're losing a lot of money because nobody's willing to buy it. So when they paid $4,000 for it, and now they're turning around and nobody's willing to buy it for more than like $1,000, and so they're losing $3,000, or maybe not even $1,000, maybe less than that, because now everybody's confidence has been shaken in the economy. So that's what causes the crash in 1929. But so that economic growth that people had been making money off of these stocks for a while was kind of a castle built on sand. It was an unstable foundation. It was wealth that wasn't really there in like actual tangible goods. Plus the farmers had already been suffering. And you see massive wealth inequality. So even though we say that the 1920s was a booming economy, it was really booming only for the upper class, and then the middle class and the lower classes were buying a lot of stuff on credit. So like the idea of a credit card or credit accounts, it's not a plastic card yet, but credit accounts had become a thing. And so people, because everybody was told the economy was doing well, even if they didn't see it in their own pocket, they would buy stuff on credit, which they couldn't really afford. And so it looked like people were doing well because they were getting this new stuff and technology and dishwashers and air conditioners and things like that. But actually their bank accounts didn't really reflect that. So you actually have a big wealth gap between, it looks like everybody's doing well, but there's actually a lot of poor people and then a few really wealthy people. And you can see this inequality in this graph. There's a lot of ways to measure inequality, but I thought this was visually the easiest way to illustrate this for you. This graph charts what the percentage of the annual income of the United States So the money being made in the United States each year, what percentage goes to the richest 1%, right? And so here you can see in 1928, right before the Great Depression hits, it's almost at 24%. So almost a quarter of every dollar made in the United States is going to the richest 1% of people. And then after the Great Depression, that drops, and it drops down here actually in the 1950s, which a lot of people consider like the heyday of American economics. It's much lower, right? There's a lot less inequality, and then things start to uptick again, particularly in the 80s, and up here in 2007, we see it hits almost 24% again. And what happens in 2007? The Great Recession, right? This isn't coincidental, right? So we can see here that massive wealth inequality, the rich getting richer while the poor get poorer, or stay the same. So comparatively getting poorer, that leads to an unstable economy, and it's prone for a massive depression. And so the question becomes, well, why? Why is that the case? How does wealth inequality lead to depression? Well, it leads to depression because the profits from the businesses are going to the owners, not the workers, right? That's how they're getting all of this money here, right? The businesses are being profitable, but all those profits are going to the CEOs, not to raising the workers' wages. So the workers are being paid so little they can't buy what they are making, right? So you say you work in a car factory and you work all day making cars, but you can't actually afford a car. Well, that means that there's going to be a lot of goods that are just kind of sitting there because there's not enough consumers to buy them. So you're making all these cars, but your workers can't buy the cars, and neither can anybody making stuff that they get paid less than a car manufacturer. So people making coats or socks or bread, they can't afford the cars either. So you're making all these cars, but there's very few people in society that can actually buy them. And so that means you got a lot of extra cars. Well, what happens if you have a lot of something? What happens to the value of it? It goes down. Well, if the value goes down, that means the companies to sell them are going to have to lower the price, which is going to cut into their profit. So they don't want to do that. So instead of lowering the price, what they're going to do is they're going to cut production. They're going to cut how many cars they're making to try and stabilize the number of cars on those lots. Well, if you're cutting how many cars you're making, do you still need a lot of workers? No. So you cut production, you also cut workers. So now you fired a bunch of workers. So these workers lost their jobs. Well, now these workers who already could not afford to buy the cars they were making, but say they could afford to buy a new winter coat, now they can't even afford to buy the new winter coat. They can't afford other things, right? Which means other businesses, say the coat manufacturers, whose workers couldn't afford to buy a new coat, but could afford to buy something else, they can't sell what they're making, right? So now there's all these extra coats on the store shelves. So there's too many coats, so they can't sell what they produce, so they're going to cut the number of coats they're making, and therefore fire the coat workers. And the coat workers who couldn't afford to buy a coat but could afford new socks, well, now they're out of work, so they can't afford new socks, so the sock businesses can't sell what they produce. So there's too many socks on the shelves, so they stop production and cut sock manufacturers who can't afford to buy bread, so the bakeries have to fire people, etc. So what do we call this? This is a bad positive feedback loop, right? It's going to continue to go until somebody steps in and breaks this cycle. This is a downward spiral. This is how wealth inequality can lead to depression. Because in order to have a functioning economy, you need consumers. We often talk about, especially in the United States, about wealthy people being jobs creators because they open a factory. And that's great. Like, they open the factory and that's helpful. But the factory is not going to create jobs for very long if nobody's buying what the factory is making, right? Consumers are really the jobs creators because they're the ones buying stuff up and keeping these businesses in business. You can see that right now with what's going on. People have lost their jobs, and so they can't afford to buy things, so more companies are going out of business. This is very evident, say, in the restaurant industry. Because you need consumers to keep people in power. It's not that the restaurant owners don't want to keep their employees employed. It's that they have no income right now because people aren't buying stuff from restaurants, so they can't stay in business. And so unless somebody comes in, this is the current government program is trying to like patch this hole and help businesses hang on long enough by giving them loans. Unless somebody comes in to short circuit this, this positive feedback loop is going to continue to cycle. And so that's what we're seeing. This is why you need consumers. You have to pay your workers enough. You have to keep inequality as little as possible, really. Not totally equal, but you have to keep your working class paid well enough that they can afford to spend stuff in society. Otherwise, businesses will go out of business because they don't have enough consumers. Okay, so this is what's happening in the United States. But we said that the Great Depression was a global depression. Why is it a global depression? Well, what happens is the US collapse triggers a domino effect worldwide. And this is because when the United States collapses, it tries to protect its own industry by raising what are called tariffs or taxes on imports from other countries. Right? So that means, like, if you are a French business and you make fine mink coats, I don't know, okay? Now the United States is going to put an extra tax on those coats so that people in the United States, the American-made fur coats will be cheaper comparatively. Whereas before maybe they were the same price roughly. Now the French coats are going to be way more expensive. So Americans buying a new fur coat will probably buy an American-made fur coat. And so the idea is that this should help keep American fur coat makers in business, because Americans, the ones who are still able to buy fur coats, because again, we have fewer consumers than we did before because of this, but the ones who still do have enough money to buy these things will buy the American-made one. This could be true for any industry: steel, chairs, toys, it doesn't matter. Well, so a tax on an import is called a tariff. Okay? And an import is something you bring into your country that was made somewhere else. So this can make sense, but it has a bigger effect, okay? So what this means is that now other countries are making less money. So like the French business now is selling fewer coats, right? And so those countries' consumers are going to have less money to buy imported US goods. So because the French business is making less money, they're going to do exactly what we saw American businesses do. They're going to cut down the number of coats they're making and therefore fire their workers. And we're going to see this cycle happen in France. It started in America, but because of these tariffs, now it's going to happen in France. And those French consumers now they don't have money. They've lost their jobs. They don't have money to buy imported US goods, right? So if we were importing French fur coats, maybe France was importing American sneakers. And now the French people can't afford to buy new sneakers. So American sneaker companies are now losing money, right? Which is going to, again, feed into this loop back inside the United States. Additionally, France is going to get mad at the United States for adding this tax on its exports, and so France is going to retaliate by putting tariffs, these taxes, on importing US goods. So now those sneakers are going to have an extra tax slapped on them, making it even harder for French people to buy US sneakers, which again is going to hurt US sneaker companies, and US sneaker companies will fire their workers. So the U.S. Exports go down. So now we're not sending as many sneakers, which is going to hurt the U.S. economy because people aren't buying those sneakers. So again, sneaker factory firing their workers. And the U.S. is going to raise tariffs even more. So now they're going to slap tariffs on other things. Italian chairs, Japanese soybeans, whatever they're making and trading. Now the United States is slapping tariffs on other things. It's going to anger those other countries. It's going to set off this cycle inside those other countries. And so basically what you see is the U.S. response in adding these tariffs is going to create a domino effect around the world. Where every country is going to be experiencing this downward spiral. And they're going to start hunkering down and looking inwards and cutting off trade ties with other countries, which is going to make their businesses worse. So the initial idea of creating tariffs can make sense, but it's going to have a bigger negative impact. And most economists agree that tariffs are generally bad. It decreases economic efficiency and causes problems like this. This is exactly, to draw this to a modern example, this is exactly what was happening in the trade war between the United States under the Trump administration and China when it came to steel tariffs. And this is what we call a trade war. And President Trump had said it's very easy to win a trade war and the United States would have no problem. But we saw that it's actually not easy to win a trade war at all. It's a positive feedback loop, a bad one that hurts both countries, because when the United States put tariffs on steel under Trump, the steel industry did do better in the United States because people in the United States were buying American steel. But that drove the price of steel up, which meant any company that actually uses steel got hurt because they had to pay more for the steel, so construction and things like that. But also, China got mad at the United States and put tariffs on American soybeans, which the United States farmers ship a lot of soybeans to China, and that's how they make their money. So it really hurt the farmers in the United States. So the United States tried to retaliate, and then China tried to retaliate again, and it went back and forth. And so both countries suffered, and different parts of their populations suffered. Okay, it also doesn't help that, remember, the United States had been kind of supporting Germany's economy, for example. So anything that happens to our economy is going to affect theirs. As a result of this, in the 1930s, as a result of this relationship here, international trade drops by 50%. It's cut in half, which is astounding, right? So what this means for just in terms of numbers. Worldwide production drops 15%. The number of stuff being produced, because like we said, we're cutting back on production to try and stabilize prices. Businesses independently are doing this. Unemployment in the United States reaches 25%. 1 out of every 4 working age adults is out of work. It is catastrophic in the United States. People really thought that the country was going to end, that democracy was over. There are riots in the streets. You've got empty houses and homeless people, right? Like, it's really, really bad. You've got people marching on Washington demanding their pensions, demanding bonuses for like military service that weren't yet due to be paid, and they're demanding it now because their families are being kicked out of their homes. It was even worse in some countries. It hit 33%. That's 1 out of every 3. So this was catastrophic, right? And so you need to be paying attention in the news right now because, again, unemployment figures are really high right now, and we're not exactly sure what they are because some unemployment claims still haven't been processed because the system wasn't designed to handle this many. But we're creeping up there. When Trump was running he was a presidential candidate at the time, he made a comment criticizing Obama, complaining about unemployment numbers. And the unemployment numbers under Obama were pretty good. Like, I think it was about 4% or so, but he was saying that he had heard that they were 10%, 20%, 30%, even as high as 40%, Trump was saying. And anybody who knows history knows that is a crazy claim because it was the worst we've ever seen in this country is 25%, and it was catastrophic. If the United States were to get to 40%, which, it's possible it could happen, but it would be apocalyptic. Like, I don't know how the country would handle that. So just a frame of reference for you, 25% is the worst we've seen in the United States. So keep an eye on what's going on, and this will give you some context. International trade, as I said, dropped 50%. Banks fail. Banks fall apart. Basically, they just run out of money. So because of all the economy collapsing, people go to the bank demanding to withdraw their savings so they can pay their bills. Well, the problem is banks don't just take your money and put it in a safe in the back and just hold on to it until you need it again. They take your money and then they loan it out to people. So this is why if you have a savings account, you earn what's called interest. It's not a lot, but the bank basically pays you for letting them use your money to loan it out to somebody else. Somebody wants to buy a house or start a business. They apply for a loan. They promise they can pay it back in, say, like 20 or 30 years. And the bank loans it out. And then by you having a savings account, you're saying, yeah, this money I'm not really going to be using. So you can loan it out. And your checking account's the one that you use to pay bills. Well, now, because everything's falling apart, people need their savings accounts to make ends meet. But the bank has loaned that money out. And so while they keep some money, because sometimes people need their savings, they don't keep everything. And so they don't have enough to give everybody their savings. And so once they run out of money, they're just out of money. Like, there's nothing you can do. This was a time before regulations, before banks were insured, before the United States promised to, like, back up the banks and cover their losses if anything happened. Those regulations come about because of what's happening in the 1930s, and hopefully you'll learn about that in U.S. history. But the banks just fall apart. So this is why if you have grandparents or great-grandparents who lived through the Great Depression, they may not trust banks. They might keep their money in their mattress or something because they grew up at a time when the banks, their parents might have lost all their life savings in a day. because the banks ran out of money and there was just nothing you could do about it. Homelessness skyrockets. Again, when you talk about capitalism being efficient, this is a period where we see capitalism and you've got a lot of people being kicked out of their homes because they can't pay the mortgage, but so you've got empty homes and a lot of homeless people. We saw the same thing happen during the Great Recession in 2008. So you're going to see people upset and angry because they've worked their whole lives to live here and it's not their fault the whole economic system just collapsed. Police sometimes violently crack down on protesters, including in the USA, even though the U.S. is supposed to have freedom of protest and assembly. Suicide rates increase a lot because in a country, especially in the United States, that says, hey, you can pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You can do anything if you just work hard enough. This is the land of opportunity. Well, when you teach people that what their outcomes in life are dependent on their actions, and then all of a sudden the world falls apart and they no longer can find a job and they can't support their family or they've lost their life savings overnight, in their head they're going to think it's their fault, right? And so they're going to look at their hungry children and they're going to feel like they've failed as their provider. And so you're going to see suicide rates jump notably, right? Because they're not thinking in terms of where they haven't been raised to believe, like sometimes there are things outside of your control, like an entire economic system collapsing. You know, it's not your fault if you can't find a job if there are no jobs, right? So it's really bleak. It's really a rough time in the United States. So here's some pictures of what we see. Huge, long lines of people waiting for food, you know, soup kitchens. But as you can see, I mean, is this soup kitchen really going to have enough to feed all these people? Probably not. In times of economic depression, private charity isn't going to cover it because you have so many people in need. You need a bigger force like the government who can work by operating on debt or can coordinate massive actions. Right? And of course, these people could also discriminate. The soup kitchens, like, you know, if you were black, they could turn you away and say, no, we're not going to feed you. You have people, you know, who've lost their homes living in tents, people begging for work, you know, demanding winter relief. People are going to be sleeping outside in the winter and possibly freezing to death, right? So it's a really bleak time. And this is what you see with laissez-faire economics. The United States isn't really going to intervene to try and fix this for a while. They're just going to hope that the market will fix it. And clearly that's not going to happen. So in the midst of all this misery, the question becomes, who do you blame? Like, who's at fault, right? And so eventually a lot of people start to blame the unregulated market, right? Once it becomes clear that, like, this is a bigger thing. It's not just me. I was bad and I lost my job because I'm not good enough. Everybody is suffering here. People start to blame the unregulated market. And so this results in two new attitudes. Both attitudes are advocating for more, far more governmental interference. So we're going from laissez-faire economics, which had been the going thing in capitalism, that hands-off, government is inefficient, it messes with the market, just let the market fix itself. Sometimes there are downturns, but they fix themselves. This is persisting for months and months and then years and years. So finally you see people start to say, no, like, something else has to be done. You can't just like wait till things get better because they're not getting better. There's too many people suffering for things to pick up again without outside intervention. And so what you see is two philosophies become more popular. The first are the socialists/communists. That's what we've been talking about. They're the ones who argue that government needs to regulate the economy, that capitalism is broken. We've had multiple depressions already in capitalist systems. This one's just by far the worst, but it clearly shows that the working class gets the short end of the stick, that the bourgeoisie don't know how to handle things, that this system doesn't work, and the government needs to come in and regulate the economy and the markets to make sure that people can't make these kinds of irresponsible decisions that crash the stock market, that when you have big sectors, the government needs to be regulating it so millions of people don't just lose their jobs. So that's the communists. And they're getting more popular, especially because communists promise to do what for people? They promise to take care of them, to put them to work, to have them be productive members, and then to take care of them in return. So that sounds pretty appealing in this condition. On the other hand, you have what are called the fascists, and that's what we're going to start talking about next, is the fascists argue that the government needs to regulate society, that people are the problem. people are broken and that it's not market capitalism that's the problem. So the fascists will be market capitalists, but it's going to be that the human beings need to be tightly controlled by the government, right? And so that's where we're going to see people like Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany come to power. So as I had said, the American system and the laissez-faire countries, they had other depressions before, and especially in the United States, it had a lot because it was a very unregulated market. And so when this first hits, the capitalist countries respond the way they always have, which is like, no, we don't really need to do anything. It'll fix itself. But ultimately, they're very slow to respond. And many governments actually cut spending. So because businesses are suffering and people are losing money, they're actually paying fewer taxes, right? Because they're earning less. And so the government's taking in less money, so they decide to cut spending because they're pulling in less money to pay for whatever programs they had. But and I know initially this might seem like, okay, well, that makes sense. If the government's making less money, they need to spend less money. But that's actually one of the worst things you can do in an economic recession or depression. It's counterproductive. Because even though it can seem logical to try and balance your country's budget, the government needs to keep the pockets of its citizens full. People need money. We've talked about this. Consumers they're the ones who power the economy. So you need people to have money in their pockets so they can spend it, so that businesses continue to be able to make money. So if you cut spending and you cut federal help, if you cut welfare programs, if you cut support for the poor at this time when people need it more than ever, it's going to not only hurt the poor, it's going to hurt businesses as well. And they're going to have to fire people, which is going to make even more poor people, right? So this is where you get what's called Keynesian economics. This is created by a man named John Maynard Keynes. He's a British economist. He's gay. Him being gay has nothing to do with his economic policy, but I just like to point out that there are LGBT people throughout history doing things and contributing. So here's one of them. His theories changed the theory and practice of macroeconomics, which means economics at the big country level. Right? So he basically kind of boils down to this. In an economic crisis, he said, governments should pay people. They need to hire people. And even though he didn't say it exactly this way, it's often been summarized as the government should pay people to dig holes and then fill them in again. Which seems ridiculous. But why? Because people need money in their pockets to buy stuff. So the government needs to put people to work. And since businesses aren't able to do this at this point, it has to be the governments that do it. Because businesses, they're not going to be able to get a loan at this point. Banks are out of money. They're not going to be loaning stuff. So the government is the only entity that can come in and say, okay, I'm the government, so I can just give you a loan. I can go into debt. I can do that. And so that's what the government needs to do. It needs to help businesses out. But more importantly, it needs to help people out. Because if the consumers have money, then businesses can exist, right? If businesses have money, but the consumers don't, the businesses will not stay in business long because they will not have any customers. So you have to help out your customers, your average citizens. You need to give them money. Obviously, it would be smarter, and Maynard Keynes says this, to have them do something useful, like build bridges or fix roads or build schools and parks or waterways, right? Have them do things that are useful, that will actually help in the future, things that you will take benefit from for decades to come. It makes sense to go into debt now, put your people back to work, put money in their pockets, and have them build something that you will get use out of for decades to come, rather than let them sit and sit in squalor, hoping that the economy fixes itself, which, especially in a catastrophe this big, is not going to happen. So, of course, there's a lot of pushback because this goes way against laissez-faire capitalism, and you have the social Darwinists arguing that this is going to make people lazy, giving people money, or that the government shouldn't be spending so much money, or that this is big government and we don't want big government, we want as small government as possible. Again, these are all arguments you're seeing happen right now in Congress about the bailouts for today. The Democrats are arguing that we need more money for working class people. They need more help. You need to cut checks for average people. And the Republicans are arguing that, no, it's going to make people lazy and they're going to become dependent on this. And so that's a bad idea. So this argument was happening in the 1930s and it's happening again today. But in the 1930s, these programs do help, but they're still, it's going to be called in the United States the New Deal. And it will be working, but then once it starts working, the government will start pulling back because, again, they're still in this mindset of laissez-faire economics and capitalism. And so they're like, okay, well, we can start cutting the money now, and then the economy will start to falter again. And they're cutting the money again because they don't believe in handing people money to help them out. So it's actually going to take over 10 years plus World War II, because politicians are willing to spend lots and lots of money to win a war. And so World War II puts a lot of people back to work. It's still the government paying them, but now it's to win a war instead of to build schools. So it's the government paying them to build tanks and shoot at enemy soldiers. And that will launch the United States out of the Great Depression, and then the rest of the world will recover in the following years. So there was actually a plan that went very much against this social Darwinist idea of poor people being lazy in the 1970s under a Republican president, Nixon, who argued for universal basic income, which is something that's kind of come to the fore again very recently with Andrew Yang running for president. But there was a time where economists around the world were arguing that, yeah, everybody on the planet basically should be given a certain amount of money, just given it each month to help support them. And this was taken as like, yeah, obviously this is the next step. And they'd done studies, and it had helped people be more productive, actually, the extra money, because it relieved stress, and it allowed people to make investments in things, in their own education, in childcare, in starting a new business and things like that. And then by the end of the 70s and the 1980s, that idea gets thrown out, and we see a return to this idea of austerity and small government. And so now that idea is coming up again for similar reasons of inequality and whatnot. Okay, you will notice that in the 2008 recession, the countries that actually adopted this policy of like paying people and helping the consumers rather than the big businesses recovered more quickly than countries that took the opposite approach of cost cutting and austerity during the recession. So John Maynard Keynes, his philosophy there. All right, that is the Great Depression, and so next time we'll be looking at the political consequences.